Her father, Mr. Kercheval, had an apprentice in the early days when I was 9 years old, and he had also a slave woman who had many merits. But I can't feel very kindly or forgivingly toward either that good apprentice boy or that good slave woman, for they saved my life. One day when I was playing on a loose log, which I supposed was attached to a raft, but it wasn't, it tilted me into Bear Creek. And when I had been underwater twice and was coming up to make the third and fatal descent, my fingers appeared above the water, and that slave woman seized them and pulled me out. Within a week I was in again, and that apprentice had to come along just at the wrong time, and he plunged in and dived, pawed around on the bottom and found me, and dragged me out and emptied the water out of me, and I was saved again. I was drowned 7 times after that before I learned to swim, once in Bear Creek and 6 times in the Mississippi. I do not now know who the people were who interfered with the intentions of a providence wiser than themselves, but I hold a grudge against them yet. When I told the tale of these remarkable happenings to Rev. Dr. Burton of Hartford, he said he did not believe it. He slipped on the ice the very next year and sprained his ankle. Will Bowen was another schoolmate, and so was his brother, Sam, who was his junior by a couple of years. Before the Civil War broke out, both became St. Louis and New Orleans pilots. Both are dead long ago. 1845. Dictated March 16, 1906. We will return to those schoolchildren of 60 years ago. I recall Mary Miller. She was not my first sweetheart, but I think she was the first one that furnished me a broken heart. I fell in love with her when she was 18 and I was 9, but she scorned me, and I recognized that this was a cold world. I had not noticed that temperature before. I believe I was as miserable as even a grown man could be. But I think that this sorrow did not remain with me long. As I remember it, I soon transferred my worship to Artemisia Briggs, who was a year older than Mary Miller. When I revealed my passion to her, she did not scoff at it. She did not make fun of it. She was very kind and gentle about it. But she was also firm and said she did not want to be pestered by children. And there was Mary Lacey. She was a schoolmate, but she also was out of my class because of her advanced age. She was pretty wild and determined and independent, but she married, and at once settled down and became in all ways a model matron and was as highly respected as any matron in the town. 4 years ago she was still living and had been married 50 years. Jimmy McDaniel was another schoolmate. His age and mine about tallied. His father kept the candy shop and he was the most envied little chap in the town, after Tom Blankenship, Huck Finn, for although we never saw him eating candy, we supposed that it was, nevertheless, his ordinary diet. He pretended that he never ate it and didn't care for it because there was nothing forbidden about it. There was plenty of it, and he could have as much of it as he wanted. He was the first human being to whom I ever told a humorous story, so far as I can remember. This was about Jim Wolfe and the cats, and I gave him that tale the morning after that memorable episode. I thought he would laugh his teeth out. I had never been so proud and happy before, and have seldom been so proud and happy since. I saw him 4 years ago when I was out there. He wore a beard, gray and venerable, that came halfway down to his knees, and yet it was not difficult for me to recognize him. He had been married 54 years. He had many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and also even posterity, they all said, thousands. Yet the boy to whom I had told the cat story, when we were callow juveniles, was still present in that cheerful little old man. Artemisia Briggs got married not long after refusing me. She married Richmond, the stone mason, who was my Methodist Sunday school teacher in the earliest days, and he had one distinction which I envied him. At some time or other he had hit his thumb with his hammer, and the result was a thumbnail which remained permanently twisted and distorted and curved and pointed, like a parrot's beak. I should not consider it an ornament now, I suppose, but it had a fascination for me then, and a vast value, because it was the only one in the town. He was a very kindly and considerate Sunday school teacher, and patient and compassionate, so he was the favorite teacher with us little chaps. In that school they had slender oblong pasteboard blue tickets, each with a verse from the Testament printed on it, and you could get a blue ticket by reciting 2 verses. By reciting 5 verses you could get 3 blue tickets, and you could trade these at the bookcase and borrow a book for a week. I was under Mr. Richmond's spiritual care, every now and then for 2 or 3 years, and he was never hard upon me. I always recited the same 5 verses every Sunday. He was always satisfied with the performance. He never seemed to notice that these were the same 5 foolish virgins that he had been hearing about every Sunday for months. I always got my tickets and exchanged them for a book. They were pretty dreary books, for there was not a bad boy in the entire bookcase. They were all good boys and good girls and drearily uninteresting, but they were better society than none, and I was glad to have their company and disapprove of it. 1849. 20 years ago, Mr. Richmond had become possessed of Tom Sawyer's cave in the hills 3 miles from town and had made a tourist resort of it. In 1849, when the gold seekers were streaming through our little town of Hannibal, many of our grown men got the gold fever, and I think that all the boys had it. On the Saturday holidays in summertime, we used to borrow skiffs whose owners were not present and go down the river 3 miles to the Cave Hollow, Missourian for valley, and there we staked out claims and pretended to dig gold, panning out half a dollar a day at first, 2 or 3 times as much later and by whole fortunes as our imaginations became inured to the work. Stupid and unprophetic lads, we were doing this in play and never suspecting why that cave hollow and all the adjacent hills were made of gold. But we did not know it. We took it for dirt. We left its rich secret in its own peaceful possession and grew up in poverty and went wandering about the world struggling for bread, and this because we had not the gift of prophecy. That region was all dirt and rocks to us, yet all it needed was to be ground up and scientifically handled, and it was gold. That is to say, the whole region was a cement mine, and they make the finest kind of Portland cement there now, 5,000 barrels a day, with a plant that cost $2 million. For a little while, Rule Gridley attended that school of ours. He was an elderly pupil. He was perhaps 22 or 23 years old. Then came the Mexican War and he volunteered. A company of infantry was raised in our town, and Mr. Hickman, a tall, straight, handsome athlete of 25, was made captain of it and had a sword by his side and a broad yellow stripe down the leg of his gray pants. And when that company marched back and forth through the streets in its smart uniform, which it did several times a day for drill, its evolutions were attended by all the boys whenever the school hours permitted. I can see that marching company yet, and I can almost feel again the consuming desire that I had to join it. But they had no use for boys of 12 and 13, and before I had a chance in another war, the desire to kill people to whom I had not been introduced had passed away. I saw the splendid Hickman in his old age. He seemed about the oldest man I had ever seen, an amazing and melancholy contrast with the showy young captain I had seen preparing his warriors for carnage so many, many years before. Hickman is dead, it is the old story. As Sussy said, what is it all for? Rule Gridley went away to the wars, and we heard of him no more for 15 or 16 years. Then one day in Carson City, while I was having a difficulty with an editor on the sidewalk, an editor better built for war than I was, I heard a voice say, "Give him the best you've got, Sam, I'm at your back." It was Rule Gridley. He said he had not recognized me by my face but by my drawling style of speech. He went down to the Reese River mines about that time, and presently he lost an election bet in his mining camp. And by the terms of it, he was obliged to buy a 50-pound sack of self-raising flour and carry it through the town, preceded by music, and deliver it to the winner of the bet. Of course, the whole camp was present and full of fluid and enthusiasm. The winner of the bet put up the sack at auction for the benefit of the United States Sanitary Fund and sold it. The excitement grew and grew. The sack was sold over and over again for the benefit of the fund. The news of it came to Virginia City by telegraph. It produced great enthusiasm, and Rule Gridley was begged by telegraph to bring the sack and have an auction in Virginia City. He brought it. An open barouche was provided, also a brass band. The sack was sold over and over again at Gold Hill, then was brought up to Virginia City toward night and sold again, and still again, netting $20,000 or $30,000 for the sanitary fund. Gridley carried it across California and sold it at various towns. He sold it for large sums in Sacramento and in San Francisco. He brought it east, sold it in New York and in various other cities, then carried it out to a great fair at St. Louis, and went on selling it, and finally made it up into small cakes and sold those at $1 apiece. First and last, the sack of flour, which had originally cost $10 perhaps, netted more than $200,000 for the sanitary fund. Rule Gridley has been dead these many, many years. It is the old story. In that school were the first Jews I had ever seen. It took me a good while to get over the awe of it. To my fancy, they were clothed invisibly in the damp and cobwebby mold of antiquity. They carried me back to Egypt, and in imagination, I moved among the pharaohs and all the shadowy celebrities of that remote age. The name of the boys was Levin. We had a collective name for them, which was the only really large and handsome witticism that was ever born in that congressional district. We called them 22, and even when the joke was old and had been worn threadbare, we always followed it with the explanation, to make sure that it would be understood, twice Levin, 22. There were other boys whose names remain with me. Irving Ayres, but no matter, he is dead. Then there was George Butler, whom I remember as a child of 7 wearing a blue leather belt with a brass buckle, and hated and envied by all the boys on account of it. He was a nephew of General Ben Butler and fought gallantly at Ball's Bluff and in several other actions of the Civil War. He is dead, long and long ago. Will Bowen, dead long ago, Ed Stevens, dead long ago, and John Briggs were special mates of mine. John is still living. 1845. In 1845, when I was 10 years old, there was an epidemic of measles in the town, and it made a most alarming slaughter among the little people. There was a funeral almost daily, and the mothers of the town were nearly demented with fright. My mother was greatly troubled. She worried over Pamela and Henry and me, and took constant and extraordinary pains to keep us from coming into contact with the contagion. But upon reflection, I believed that her judgment was at fault. It seemed to me that I could improve upon it if left to my own devices. I cannot remember now whether I was frightened about the measles or not, but I clearly remember that I grew very tired of the suspense I suffered on account of being continually under the threat of death. I remember that I got so weary of it and so anxious to have the matter settled one way or the other, and promptly, that this anxiety spoiled my days and my nights. I had no pleasure in them. I made up my mind to end this suspense and be done with it. Will Bowen was dangerously ill with the measles, and I thought I would go down there and catch them. I entered the house by the front way and slipped along through rooms and halls, keeping sharp watch against discovery, and at last I reached Will's bedchamber in the rear of the house on the second floor and got into it uncaptured. But that was as far as my victory reached. His mother caught me there a moment later and snatched me out of the house and gave me a most competent scolding and drove me away. She was so scared that she could hardly get her words out, and her face was white. I saw that I must manage better next time, and I did. I hung about the lane at the rear of the house and watched through cracks in the fence until I was convinced that the conditions were favorable. Then I slipped through the backyard and up the back way and got into the room and into the bed with Will Bowen without being observed. I don't know how long I was in the bed. I only remember that Will Bowen, as society, had no value for me, for he was too sick to even notice that I was there. When I heard his mother coming, I covered up my head, but that device was a failure. It was dead summertime. The cover was nothing more than a limp blanket or sheet, and anybody could see that there were two of us under it. It didn't remain too very long. Mrs. Bowen snatched me out of the bed and conducted me home herself, with a grip on my collar which she never loosened until she delivered me into my mother's hands, along with her opinion of that kind of a boy. It was a good case of measles that resulted. It brought me within a shade of death's door. It brought me to where I no longer took any interest in anything, but, on the contrary, felt a total absence of interest, which was most placid and enchanting. I have never enjoyed anything in my life any more than I enjoyed dying that time. I was, in effect, dying. The word had been passed and the family notified to assemble around the bed and see me off. I knew them all. There was no doubtfulness in my vision. They were all crying, but that did not affect me. I took but the vaguest interest in it, and that merely because I was the center of all this emotional attention and was gratified by it and vain of it. When Dr. Cunningham had made up his mind that nothing more could be done for me, he put bags of hot ashes all over me. He put them on my breast, on my wrists, on my ankles, and so, very much to his astonishment, and doubtless to my regret, he dragged me back into this world and set me going again. Dictated July 26, 1907, in an article entitled England's Ovation to Mark Twain, Sydney Brooks, but never mind that now. I was in Oxford by 7 o'clock that evening, June 25, 1907, and trying on the scarlet gown which the tailor had been constructing, and found it right and surpassingly becoming. At 10:30 the next morning we assembled at All Souls College and marched thence, gowned, mortar-boarded and in double file, down a long street to the Sheldonian Theatre, between solid walls of the populace, very much hurrahed and limitlessly kodacked. We made a procession of considerable length and distinction and picturesqueness, with the Chancellor, Lord Curzon, late Viceroy of India, in his rich robe of black and gold, in the lade, followed by a pair of trim little boy train-bearers, and the train-bearers followed by the young Prince Arthur of Connaught, who was to be made a DCL. The detachment of DCLs were followed by the doctors of science, and these by the doctors of literature, and these in turn by the doctors of music. Sidney Colvin marched in front of me. I was coupled with Sidney Lee, and Kipling followed us. General Booth of the Salvation Army was in the squadron of DCLs. Our journey ended, we were halted in a fine old hall whence we could see, through a corridor of some length, the massed audience in the theatre. Here for a little time we moved about and chatted and made acquaintanceships. Then the DCLs were summoned, and they marched through that corridor and the shouting began in the theater. It would be some time before the doctors of literature and of science would be called for, because each of those DCLs had to have a couple of Latin speeches made over him before his promotion would be complete, one by the Regius Professor of Civil Law, the other by the Chancellor. After a while, I asked Sir William Ramsay if a person might smoke here and not get shot. He said, yes, but that whoever did it and got caught would be fined a guinea, and perhaps hanged later. He said he knew of a place where we could accomplish at least as much as half of a smoke before any informers would be likely to chance upon us, and he was ready to show the way to any who might be willing to risk the guinea and the hanging. By request he led the way, and Kipling, Sir Norman Lockyer and I followed. We crossed an unpopulated quadrangle and stood under one of its exits, an archway of massive masonry, and there we lit up and began to take comfort. The photographers soon arrived, but they were courteous and friendly and gave us no trouble, and we gave them none. They grouped us in all sorts of ways and photographed us at their diligent leisure, while we smoked and talked. We were there more than an hour. Then we returned to headquarters, happy, content, and greatly refreshed. Presently we filed into the theater, under a very satisfactory hurrah, and waited in a crimson column, dividing the crowded pit through the middle, until each of us in his turn should be called to stand before the Chancellor and hear our merits set forth in sonorous Latin. Meantime, Kipling and I wrote autographs until some good kind soul interfered in our behalf and procured for us a rest. I will now save what is left of my modesty by quoting a paragraph from Sidney Brooks's Ovation. Let those stars take the place of it for the present. Sidney Brooks has done it well. It makes me proud to read it, as proud as I was in that old day, 62 years ago, when I lay dying, the center of attraction, with one eye piously closed upon the fleeting vanities of this life, an excellent effect, and the other open a crack to observe the tears, the sorrow, the admiration, all for me, all for me. Ah, that was the proudest moment of my long life, until Oxford. Most Americans have been to Oxford, and will remember what a dream of the Middle Ages it is, with its crooked lanes, its gray and stately piles of ancient architecture, and its meditation-breeding air of repose and dignity and unkinship, with the noise and fret and hurry and bustle of these modern days. As a dream of the Middle Ages, Oxford was not perfect, until Pageant Day arrived and furnished certain details which had been for generations lacking. These details began to appear at mid-afternoon on the 27th. At that time, singles, couples, groups, and squadrons of the 3,500 costumed characters who were to take part in the pageant began to ooze and drip and stream through house doors, all over the old town, and wend toward the meadows outside the walls. Soon the lanes were thronged with costumes which Oxford had from time to time seen and been familiar with in bygone centuries. Fashions of dress which marked off centuries as by dates, and milestoned them back and back and back, until history faded into legend and tradition, when Arthur was a fact and the Round Table a reality. In this rich commingling of quaint and strange and brilliantly colored fashions, in dress the dress changes of Oxford for 12 centuries stood livid and realized to the eye. Oxford as a dream of the Middle Ages was complete now as it had never, in our day, before been complete. At last there was no discord. The moldering old buildings and the picturesque throngs drifting past them were in harmony. Soon, astonishingly soon, the only persons that seemed out of place, and grotesquely and offensively and criminally out of place, were such persons as came intruding along clothed in the ugly and odious fashions of the 20th century. They were a bitterness to the feelings, an insult to the eye. The makeups of illustrious historic personages seemed perfect, both as to portraiture and costume. One had no trouble in recognizing them. Also, I was apparently quite easily recognizable myself. The first corner I turned brought me suddenly face to face with Henry Roman VIII, a person whom I had been implacably disliking for 60 years. But when he put out his hand with royal courtliness and grace and said, "Welcome, well-beloved stranger, to my century and to the hospitalities of my realm," my old prejudices vanished away and I forgave him. I think now that Henry VIII has been overabused, and that most of us, if we had been situated as he was, domestically, would not have been able to get along with as limited a graveyard as he forced himself to put up with. I feel now that he was one of the nicest men in history. Personal contact with a king is more effective in removing baleful prejudices than is any amount of argument drawn from tales and histories. If I had a child, I would name it Henry VIII, regardless of sex. Do you remember Charles I? And his broad slouch with the plume in it, and his slender, tall figure, and his body clothed in velvet doublet with lace sleeves, and his legs in leather, with long rapier at his side and his spurs on his heels. I encountered him at the next corner, and knew him in a moment, knew him as perfectly and as vividly as I should know the Grand Chain in the Mississippi, if I should see it from the pilot house, after all these years. He bent his body and gave his hat a sweep that fetched its plume within an inch of the ground, and gave me a welcome that went to my heart. This king has been much maligned. I shall understand him better hereafter, and shall regret him more than I have been in the habit of doing these 50 or 60 years. He did some things in his time, which might better have been left undone, and which cast a shadow upon his name. We all know that, we all concede it. But our error has been in regarding them as crimes, and in calling them by that name, whereas I perceive now that they were only indiscretions. At every few steps I met persons of deathless name whom I had never encountered before outside of pictures and statuary and history, and these were most thrilling and charming encounters. I had handshakes with Henry II, who had not been seen in the Oxford streets for nearly 800 years, and with the fair Rosamond, whom I now believe to have been chaste and blameless, although I had thought differently about it before, and with Shakespeare, one of the pleasantest foreigners I have ever gotten acquainted with, and with Roger Bacon, and with Queen Elizabeth, who talked 5 minutes and never swore once, a fact which gave me a new and good opinion of her, and moved me to forgive her for beheading the Scottish Mary, if she really did it, which I now doubt, and with the quaintly and anciently clad young King Harold Harefoot of near 900 years ago, who came flying by on a bicycle and smoking a pipe, but at once checked up and got off to shake with me. And also I met a bishop who had lost his way, because this was the first time he had been inside the walls of Oxford for as much as 1200 years, or thereabouts. By this time I had grown so used to the obliterated ages and their best-known people, that if I had met Adam, I should not have been either surprised or embarrassed. And if he had come in a racing automobile and a cloud of dust, with nothing on but his fig leaf, it would have seemed to me all right and harmonious. Mark Twain. To be continued. Chapters from My Autobiography, Roman 24. By Mark Twain. From Sussie's Biography of Me. Mama and Papa have returned from Onteora, and they have had a delightful visit. Mr. Frank Stockton was down in Virginia and could not reach Onteora in time, so they did not see him, and Mrs. Mary Mapps Dodge was ill and couldn't go to Onteora, but Mrs. General Custer was there, and Mama said that she was a very attractive, sweet-appearing woman. Dictated October 9, 1906. Onteora was situated high up in the Catskill Mountains, in the center of a far-reaching solitude. I do not mean that the region was wholly uninhabited. There were farmhouses here and there, at generous distances apart. Their occupants were descendants of ancestors who had built the houses in Rip Van Winkle's time, or earlier, and those ancestors were not more primitive than were this posterity of theirs. The city people were as foreign and unfamiliar and strange to them as monkeys would have been, and they would have respected the monkeys as much as they respected these elegant summer resorters. The resorters were a puzzle to them. Their ways were so strange, and their interests so trivial. They drove the resorters over the mountain roads, and listened in shamed surprise at their bursts of enthusiasm over the scenery. The farmers had had that scenery on exhibition from their mountain roosts all their lives, and had never noticed anything remarkable about it. By way of an incident, a pair of these primitives were overheard chatting about the resorters, one day, and in the course of their talk this remark was dropped. "I was driven a passel of 'em round about yesterday evenin', quiet ones, still and solemn, and all to once they busted out to make your hair lift, and I judged hell was to pay. Now what do you reckon it was? It wa'n't anything but just one of them common damned yaller sunsets. In those days." Tuesday, October 16, 1906. Warner is gone. Stockton is gone. I attended both funerals. Warner was a near neighbor from the autumn of '71 until his death, 19 years afterward. It is not the privilege of the most of us to have many intimate friends. A dozen is our aggregate, but I think he could count his by the score. It is seldom that a man is so beloved by both sexes and all ages as Warner was. There was a charm about his spirit, and his ways, and his words that won all that came within the sphere of its influence. Our children adopted him while they were little creatures, and thenceforth to the end he was Cousin Charlie to them. He was Uncle Charlie to the children of more than one other friend. Mrs. Clemens was very fond of him, and he always called her by her first name shortened. Warner died as she died, and as I would die, without premonition, without a moment's warning. Uncle Remus still lives, and must be over 1,000 years old. Indeed, I know that this must be so, because I have seen a new photograph of him in the public prints within the last month or so, and in that picture his aspects are distinctly and strikingly geological, and one can see he is thinking about the mastodons and plesiosaurians that he used to play with when he was young. It is just a quarter of a century since I have seen Uncle Remus. He visited us in our home in Hartford and was reverently devoured by the big eyes of Sussy and Clara, for I made a deep and awful impression upon the little creatures, who knew his book by heart through my nightly declamation of its tales to them, by revealing to them privately that he was the real Uncle Remus whitewashed so that he could come into people's houses the front way. He was the bashfulest grown person I have ever met. When there were people about, he stayed silent and seemed to suffer until they were gone. But he was lovely, nevertheless, for the sweetness and benignity of the immortal Remus looked out from his eyes, and the graces and sincerities of his character shone in his face. It may be that Jim Wolfe was as bashful as Harris. It hardly seems possible, yet as I look back 56 years and consider Jim Wolfe, I am almost persuaded that he was. He was our long, slim apprentice in my brother's printing office in Hannibal. He was 17, and yet he was as much as 4 times as bashful as I was, though I was only 14. He boarded and slept in the house, but he was always tongue-tied in the presence of my sister, and when even my gentle mother spoke to him, he could not answer save in frightened monosyllables. He would not enter a room where a girl was. Nothing could persuade him to do such a thing. Once when he was in our small parlor alone, 2 majestic old maids entered and seated themselves in such a way that Jim could not escape without passing by them. He would as soon have thought of passing by one of Harris's plesiosaurians 90 feet long. I came in presently, was charmed with the situation, and sat down in a corner to watch Jim suffer and enjoy it. My mother followed a minute later and sat down with the visitors and began to talk. Jim sat upright in his chair, and during a quarter of an hour he did not change his position by a shade. Neither General Grant nor a bronze image could have maintained that immovable pose more successfully. I mean as to body and limbs. With the face there was a difference. By fleeting revealments of the face I saw that something was happening, something out of the common. There would be a sudden twitch of the muscles of the face, an instant distortion, which in the next instant had passed and left no trace. These twitches gradually grew in frequency, but no muscle outside of the face lost any of its rigidity or betrayed any interest in what was happening to Jim. I mean if something was happening to him, and I knew perfectly well that that was the case. At last a pair of tears began to swim slowly down his cheeks amongst the twitchings, but Jim sat still and let them run. Then I saw his right hand steal along his thigh until halfway to his knee, then take a vigorous grip upon the cloth. That was a wasp that he was grabbing. A colony of them were climbing up his legs and prospecting around, and every time he winced they stabbed him to the hilt. So for a quarter of an hour one group of excursionists after another climbed up Jim's legs and resented even the slightest wince or squirm that he indulged himself with in his misery. When the entertainment had become nearly unbearable, he conceived the idea of gripping them between his fingers and putting them out of commission. He succeeded with many of them, but at great cost, for, as he couldn't see the wasp, he was as likely to take hold of the wrong end of him as he was the right. Then the dying wasp gave him a punch to remember the incident by. If those ladies had stayed all day, and if all the wasps in Missouri had come and climbed up Jim's legs, nobody there would ever have known it but Jim and the wasps and me. There he would have sat until the ladies left. When they finally went away, we went upstairs and he took his clothes off, and his legs were a picture to look at. They looked as if they were mailed all over with shirt buttons, each with a single red hole in the center. The pain was intolerable. No, would have been intolerable, but the pain of the presence of those ladies had been so much harder to bear that the pain of the wasp stings was quite pleasant and enjoyable by comparison. Jim never could enjoy wasps, I remember once. From Sussy's biography of me. Mama has given me a very pleasant little newspaper scrap about Papa to copy. I will put it in here. Thursday, October 11, 1906. It was a rather strong compliment. I think I will leave it out. It was from James Redpath. The chief ingredients of Redpath's makeup were honesty, sincerity, kindliness, and pluck. He wasn't afraid. He was one of Oswatomi Brown's right-hand men in the bleeding Kansas days. He was all through that struggle. He carried his life in his hands, and from one day to another it wasn't worth the price of a night's lodging. He had a small body of daring men under him, and they were constantly being hunted by the Jayhawkers, who were pro-slavery Missourians, guerrillas, modern free lances. Friday, October 12, 1906. I can't think of the name of that daredevil guerrilla who led the Jayhawkers and chased Redpath up and down the country, and, in turn, was chased by Redpath. By grace of the chances of war, the two men never met in the field, though they several times came within an ace of it. 10 or 12 years later, Redpath was earning his living in Boston as chief of the lecture business in the United States. 15 or 16 years after his Kansas adventures, I became a public lecturer, and he was my agent. Along there somewhere was a press dinner, one November night at the Tremont Hotel in Boston, and I attended it. I sat near the head of the table, with Redpath between me and the chairman. A stranger sat on my other side. I tried several times to talk with the stranger, but he seemed to be out of words, and I presently ceased from troubling him. He was manifestly a very shy man, and moreover, he might have been losing sleep the night before. The first man called up was Redpath. At the mention of the name, the stranger started and showed interest. He fixed a fascinated eye on Redpath and lost not a word of his speech. Redpath told some stirring incidents of his career in Kansas and said, among other things, "3 times I came near capturing the gallant Jayhawker chief, and once he actually captured me, but didn't know me and let me go, because he said he was hot on Redpath's trail and couldn't afford to waste time and rope on inconsequential small fry." My stranger was called up next, and when Redpath heard his name, he, in turn, showed a startled interest. The stranger said, bending a caressing glance upon Redpath and speaking gently, I may even say sweetly, "You realize that I was that Jayhawker chief. I am glad to know you now and take you to my heart and call you friend." Then he added, in a voice that was pathetic with regret, "But if I had only known you then, what tumultuous happiness I should have had in your society, while it lasted." The last quarter of a century of my life has been pretty constantly and faithfully devoted to the study of the human race. That is to say, the study of myself. For, in my individual person, I am the entire human race compacted together. I have found that then is no ingredient of the race which I do not possess in either a small way or a large way. When it is small, as compared with the same ingredient in somebody else, there is still enough of it for all the purposes of examination. In my contacts with the species, I find no one who possesses a quality which I do not possess. The shades of difference between other people and me serve to make variety and prevent monotony, but that is all. Broadly speaking, we are all alike. And so, by studying myself carefully and comparing myself with other people, and noting the divergences, I have been enabled to acquire a knowledge of the human race, which I perceive is more accurate and more comprehensive than that which has been acquired and revealed by any other member of our species. As a result, my private and concealed opinion of myself is not of a complimentary sort. It follows that my estimate of the human race is the duplicate of my estimate of myself. I am not proposing to discuss all of the peculiarities of the human race at this time. I only wish to touch lightly upon one or two of them. To begin with, I wonder why a man should prefer a good billiard table to a poor one, and why he should prefer straight cues to crooked ones, and why he should prefer round balls to chipped ones, and why he should prefer a level table to one that slants, and why he should prefer responsive cushions to the dull and unresponsive kind. I wonder at these things, because when we examine the matter, we find that the essentials involved in billiards are as competently and exhaustively furnished by a bad billiard outfit as they are by the best one. One of the essentials is amusement. Very well, if there is any more amusement to be gotten out of the one outfit than out of the other, the facts are in favor of the bad outfit. The bad outfit will always furnish 30% more fun for the players and for the spectators than will the good outfit. Another essential of the game is that the outfit shall give the players full opportunity to exercise their best skill and display it in a way to compel the admiration of the spectators. Very well, the bad outfit is nothing behind the good one in this regard. It is a difficult matter to estimate correctly the eccentricities of chipped balls and a slanting table, and make the right allowance for them, and secure a count. The finest kind of skill is required to accomplish the satisfactory result. Another essential of the game is that it shall add to the interest of the game by furnishing opportunities to bet. Very well, in this regard no good outfit can claim any advantage over a bad one. I know, by experience, that a bad outfit is as valuable as the best one, that an outfit that couldn't be sold at auction for $7 is just as valuable for all the essentials of the game as an outfit that is worth 1,000. I acquired some of this learning in Jackass Gulch, California, more than 40 years ago. Jackass Gulch had once been a rich and thriving surface mining camp. By and by its gold deposits were exhausted. Then the people began to go away, and the town began to decay, and rapidly. In my time, it had disappeared. Where the bank and the city hall and the church and the gambling dens and the newspaper office and the streets of brick blocks had been, was nothing now but a wide and beautiful expanse of green grass, a peaceful and charming solitude. Half a dozen scattered dwellings were still inhabited, and there was still one saloon of a ruined and rickety character struggling for life, but doomed. In its bar was a billiard outfit that was the counterpart of the one in my father-in-law's garret. The balls were chipped, the cloth was darned and patched, the table's surface was undulating, and the cues were headless and had the curve of a parenthesis. But the forlorn remnant of marooned miners played games there, and those games were more entertaining to look at than a circus and a grand opera combined. Nothing but a quite extraordinary skill could score a carom on that table. A skill that required the nicest estimate of force, distance, and how much to allow for the various slants of the table and the other formidable peculiarities and idiosyncrasies furnished by the contradictions of the outfit. Last winter, here in New York, I saw Hop and Schieffer and Sutton, and the 3 or 4 other billiard champions of worldwide fame, contend against each other. And certainly the art and science displayed were a wonder to see. Yet I saw nothing there in the way of science and art that was more wonderful than shots which I had seen Texas Tom make on the wavy surface of that poor old wreck in the perishing saloon at Jackass Gulch 40 years before. Once I saw Texas Tom make a string of 7 points on a single inning. All calculated shots, and not a fluke or a scratch among them. I often saw him make runs of 4, but when he made his great string of 7, the boys went wild with enthusiasm and admiration. The joy and the noise exceeded that which the great gathering at Madison Square produced when Sutton scored 500 points at the 18-inch game on a world-famous night last winter. With practice, that champion could score 19 or 20 on the Jackass Gulch table. But to start with, Texas Tom would show him miracles that would astonish him. Also, it might have another handsome result. It might persuade the great experts to discard their own trifling game and bring the Jackass Gulch outfit here and exhibit their skill in a game worth 100 of the discarded one, for profound and breathless interest, and for displays of almost superhuman skill. In my experience, games played with a fiendish outfit furnish ecstasies of delight, which games played with the other kind cannot match. 27 years ago, my budding little family spent the summer at Bateman's Point, near Newport, Rhode Island. It was a comfortable boarding place, well stocked with sweet mothers and little children, but the male sex was scarce. However, there was another young fellow besides myself, and he and I had good times. Higgins was his name, but that was not his fault. He was a very pleasant and companionable person. On the premises, there was what had once been a bowling alley. It was a single alley, and it was estimated that it had been out of repair for 60 years. But not the balls were in good condition. There were 41 of them, and they ranged in size from a grapefruit up to a lignum vitae sphere that you could hardly lift. Higgins and I played on that alley day after day. At first, one of us located himself at the bottom end to set up the pins in case anything should happen to them, but nothing happened. The surface of that alley consisted of a rolling stretch of elevations and depressions, and neither of us could, by any art known to us, persuade a ball to stay on the alley until it should accomplish something. Little balls and big, the same thing always happened. The ball left the alley before it was halfway home and went thundering down alongside of it the rest of the way, and made the gamekeeper climb out and take care of himself. No matter, we persevered and were rewarded. We examined the alley, noted and located a lot of its peculiarities, and little by little we learned how to deliver a ball in such a way that it would travel home and knock down a pin or two. By and by we succeeded in improving our game to a point where we were able to get all of the pins with 35 balls, so we made it a 35-ball game. If the player did not succeed with 35, he had lost the game. I suppose that all the balls, taken together, weighed 500 pounds or maybe a ton, or along there somewhere. But anyway, it was hot weather, and by the time that a player had sent 35 of them home, he was in a drench of perspiration and physically exhausted. Next, we started cocked hat, that is to say, a triangle of 3 pins, the other 7 being discarded. In this game, we used the 3 smallest balls and kept on delivering them until we got the 3 pins down. After a day or two of practice, we were able to get the chief pin with an output of 4 balls, but it cost us a great many deliveries to get the other 2. But by and by we succeeded in perfecting our art. At least we perfected it to our limit. We reached a scientific excellence where we could get the 3 pins down with 12 deliveries of the 3 small balls, making 36 shots to conquer the cocked hat. Having reached our limit for daylight work, we set up a couple of candles and played at night. As the alley was 50 or 60 feet long, we couldn't see the pins, but the candles indicated their locality. We continued this game until we were able to knock down the invisible pins with 36 shots. Having now reached the limit of the candle game, we changed and played it left-handed. We continued the left-handed game until we conquered its limit, which was 54 shots. Sometimes we sent down a succession of 15 balls without getting anything at all. We easily got out of that old alley 5 times the fun that anybody could have gotten out of the best alley in New York. One blazing hot day, a modest and courteous officer of the regular army appeared in our den and introduced himself. He was about 35 years old, well-built and militarily erect and straight, and he was hermetically sealed up in the uniform of that ignorant old day. A uniform made of heavy material, and much proper for January than July. When he saw the venerable alley, and glanced from that to the long procession of shining balls in the trough, his eye lit with desire, and we judged that he was our meat. We politely invited him to take a hand, and he could not conceal his gratitude, though his breeding and the etiquette of his profession made him try. We explained the game to him, and said that there were 41 balls, and that the player was privileged to extend his inning and keep on playing until he had used them all up, repeatedly, and that for every 10 strike he got a prize. We didn't name the prize, it wasn't necessary, as no prize would ever be needed or called for. He started a sarcastic smile, but quenched it, according to the etiquette of his profession. He merely remarked that he would like to select a couple of medium balls and one small one, adding that he didn't think he would need the rest. Then he began, and he was an astonished man. He couldn't get a ball to stay on the alley. When he had fired about 15 balls and hadn't yet reached the cluster of pins, his annoyance began to show out through his clothes. He wouldn't let it show in his face, but after another 15 balls, he was not able to control his face. He didn't utter a word, but he exuded mute blasphemy from every pore. He asked permission to take off his coat, which was granted. Then he turned himself loose with bitter determination, and although he was only an infantry officer he could have been mistaken for a battery, he got up such a volleying thunder with those balls. Presently he removed his cravat, after a little he took off his vest, and still he went bravely on. Higgins was suffocating. My condition was the same, but it would not be courteous to laugh. It would be better to burst, and we came near it. That officer was good pluck. He stood to his work without uttering a word, and kept the balls going until he had expended the outfit 4 times, making 4 times 41 shots. Then he had to give it up, and he did, for he was no longer able to stand without wobbling. He put on his clothes, bade us a courteous goodbye, invited us to call at the fort, and started away. Then he came back and said, "What is the prize for the 10 strike?" We had to confess that we had not selected it yet. He said, gravely, that he thought there was no occasion for hurry about it. I believe Bateman's Alley was a better one than any other in America, in the matter of the essentials of the game. It compelled skill, it provided opportunity for bets, and if you could get a stranger to do the bowling for you, there was more and wholesomer and delightfuler entertainment to be got out of his industries than out of the finest game by the best expert, and played upon the best alley elsewhere in existence. Mark Twain. To be continued. North American Review. Number DCXXV. December 1907. Chapters from My Autobiography, Roman 25. By Mark Twain. January 11, 1906. Answer to a letter received this morning. Dear Mrs. H., I am forever your debtor for reminding me of that curious passage in my life. During the first year or 2 after it happened, I could not bear to think of it. My pain and shame were so intense, and my sense of having been an imbecile so settled, established, and confirmed, that I drove the episode entirely from my mind. And so all these 28 or 29 years, I have lived in the conviction that my performance of that time was coarse, vulgar, and destitute of humor. But your suggestion that you and your family found humor in it 28 years ago moved me to look into the matter. So I commissioned a Boston typewriter to delve among the Boston papers of that bygone time and send me a copy of it. It came this morning, and if there is any vulgarity about it, I am not able to discover it. If it isn't innocently and ridiculously funny, I am no judge. I will see to it that you get a copy. Address of Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain.